The line hits you sideways when you hear it. We do not need Canada. That wasn't some late-night rant or an offhand comment on social media. It came from the U.S. ambassador to Canada, said calmly, on radio, with zero hesitation. And the timing? That's the part that makes everything feel off, because this wasn't said during a trade lull or a quiet diplomatic moment. It was said while Canada was actively signing major deals elsewhere and openly stepping out of Washington's economic orbit.
The president of the U.S. yesterday at the factory at Ford in Dearborn, and he says, we don't need their products. We don't need the cars made in Canada. And he said it about so many Canadian products, lumber, steel, energy, you name it. So what is it, Ambassador Hoekstra? Do you need us or do you not need us?
Well, I think the key operative word is need. Mm-hmm. All right? No, we do not need Canada.
And that's where things get interesting. Just days earlier, Canada wrapped up a sweeping reset with China. Not vague cooperation, real, concrete moves. Electric vehicle tariffs lowered, canola restrictions eased, visa-free travel announced. Chinese EV manufacturing discussions suddenly pointing toward Canada. That alone sent ripples through Washington. But Canada didn't stop there. Mark Carney didn't linger for applause or headlines. He boarded a plane and landed in Qatar, one of the most powerful capital hubs on Earth, to talk investment, not symbolism. So when the U.S. ambassador went on air and said flatly, "No, we do not need Canada," it didn't land like confidence. It landed like something else entirely. Here's why. Ambassadors don't usually talk that way unless they feel leverage slipping. Diplomats are trained to hedge, to soften, to leave doors open. This wasn't that. This sounded reactive. And when you line it up with the timeline, it starts to look less like strength and more like a response to momentum that Washington didn't expect. Let's slow this down, because most coverage skips the context that actually explains the tension. For decades, the U.S.-Canada relationship ran on an unspoken assumption. Canada was economically integrated and strategically aligned, and there weren't many viable alternatives. Supply chains were intertwined. Auto manufacturing flowed across the border. Energy, lumber, steel, agriculture. It all moved back and forth with the understanding that alignment was automatic. That assumption did a lot of quiet work for Washington, but it only works if Canada believes it has nowhere else to go.
So this is the first trip by a sitting prime minister in Canada to visit Qatar. How significant is that?
Very important because, of course, as we understand, these Gulf states are cash rich. And I like the way Annie Bergeron-Oliver set it up. She's saying, look, they're trying to find countries where they can invest and their money won't disappear and you can have an honest court system and the rule of law and so forth. So that's one of the advantages of being a democracy. Now, not all the countries that we work with or trade with are democracies. We just got a good taste of that with the visit to China. But the overall approach here that Carney has been taking for the past, 10 months or so since he became prime minister is essentially, we've got to find new partners. We've got to make deals around the world. We've got to sell Canada's best assets, and that includes selling us as a safe place to invest.
China cracked that assumption. Not because China suddenly replaced the U.S. as Canada's primary partner, but because it proved something more subtle and more unsettling. Canada could negotiate, diversify, and move forward without asking permission. The China reset wasn't just about tariffs or market access. It was a signal that Canada was willing to rebalance, even if that made Washington uncomfortable. And then came Qatar. Here's the part most people overlook. Trade deals move products. Capital deals reshape countries. Qatar isn't just another stop on a diplomatic tour. It's one of the world's most influential sources of long-term investment capital, with sovereign wealth measured in the hundreds of billions and an investment horizon that stretches decades into the future. This isn't money chasing short-term gains. This is capital that builds railways, energy systems, ports, pipelines, and infrastructure that defines a country's trajectory for generations. So when Mark Carney lands in Doha, he isn't talking quotas or tariffs. He's selling Canada as a place where capital is safe, contracts are enforced, courts function, and political chaos doesn't wipe out long-term plans. That distinction matters more than it sounds, because once global capital commits, it doesn't leave quietly. It builds roots. It creates inertia. And that's the kind of relationship that changes how a country is treated on the world stage. Some commentators framed the Qatar visit as symbolic. In my view, that misses the point entirely. Symbolic trips don't unsettle ambassadors. Capital conversations do, and that's why the tone shifted. When asked directly whether the U.S. needs Canada, the ambassador didn't qualify his answer. He didn't say, "We value the relationship," or "We're mutually beneficial partners." He said no, flatly. Here's the part most people misunderstand. That line wasn't really about trade at all. It was about control. Washington's leverage over Canada has always depended on the idea that economic pressure would work. Tariff threats, trade disputes, political pressure, all of that only functions if the other side lacks credible alternatives. China showed Canada had options. Qatar suggests Canada may soon have backing. That combination changes the equation. Trade partners can come and go. Capital alliances are different. When major investment hubs start viewing Canada as a preferred destination, it sends a signal far beyond Ottawa or Washington. It tells global markets that Canada is operating independently, with diversified relationships and reduced exposure to any single political mood swing. And U.S. officials understand exactly what that means. Because once capital flows diversify, pressure stops working the way it used to. Tariff threats lose bite. Diplomatic bullying stops moving markets. Even political rhetoric starts to sound hollow when the other side isn't financially cornered. That's why the ambassador's comment didn't come off as dominance. It came off as irritation, almost defensive. Now here's where the irony sharpens. For years, the U.S. never needed to say it didn't need Canada. The relationship was assumed. Auto plants in Ontario fed U.S. dealerships. Canadian energy powered American cities. Lumber, steel, agriculture. It all flowed under the expectation of stability. That stability cracked when unpredictability replaced trust. Donald Trump didn't invent economic pressure, but he normalized using it casually, publicly, and repeatedly against allies. Tariff threats became routine. Public insults became strategy. Reliability disappeared. And when that happens, rational governments do what rational governments always do. They look for alternatives. This is where some people get the story backwards. Canada didn't wake up one day and decide to sideline the U.S. Mark Carney didn't set out to rewrite alliances for fun. He responded to risk. He responded to volatility. He responded to a partner that suddenly treated dependence as leverage instead of responsibility. And once that process starts, it's hard to reverse. This is where Carney's background matters, and it's not just resume padding. When people say he's Mark Carney, they're not being cute. They're pointing to credibility. As governor of the Bank of Canada and later the Bank of England, Carney built a reputation for navigating chaos without theatrics. He helped steady the UK through the unpredictable turbulence of Brexit when confidence mattered as much as policy. Global capital remembers that. So when Carney walks into a room in Beijing or Doha, he doesn't have to prove seriousness. It's assumed. That's why doors open quickly. That's why meetings turn substantive fast. And that's why these moves are landing now, not years from now. From the reactions I've seen, this is the part that's unsettling Washington the most. This isn't Canada drifting accidentally. This is Canada repositioning deliberately, with competence, and without drama. And when American officials say we don't need Canada, what they may really be admitting is something they're not ready to say out loud. They no longer get to dictate Canada's choices. That loss doesn't show up in a single headline. It shows up gradually, in investment flows choosing Canada over uncertainty, in factories planned with non-U.S. capital, in infrastructure funded without Washington's approval, in trade routes that no longer hinge on one border. That's the kind of shift that doesn't reverse easily. What happens next won't be announced all at once. There won't be a dramatic press conference declaring a new era. It'll show up quietly in balance sheets and boardrooms, in long-term projects that assume Canada's independence rather than question it. And the real question isn't whether Mark Carney can keep building momentum. It's whether Washington knows how to respond to a Canada that isn't asking what it's allowed to do anymore. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.